authorities to consider, quote, what course may be taken for teaching boys and girls the spinning of yarn, and a few years later, each family was required to furnish, oh, and I meant to bring 3 pounds to show you, required to furnish a spinner to spin 3 pounds a month for 30 weeks, which is approximately 7 months. So each family was required to come up with 21 pounds of homespun.
Is that a lot?
It really isn't. If I had remembered, which I remembered at 3 o'clock but forgot by the time I left, I was going to bring in 12 skeins, 12 4-ounce skeins of my yarn just to show you what it looks like. But I forgot. But it's not a lot, surprisingly, actually. The first breeds that would have been brought in were, of course, English breeds, Wiltshires, Romneys, Rylands, Cotswolds, Shropshire, Oxford Downs, all of that kind of sheep. And they tended to be not particularly good for wool. They were coarse or middling grade fleece. They were leggy animals, so they didn't, produce a whole lot of wool anyway. Special rights were given to the people who raised sheep in the 17th century that they could put their sheep on the common grounds for grazing. And I read, and this is almost hard to believe, that in 1640 they estimate there were about 100,000 sheep in Massachusetts and only 20,000 people. Now I'm going to assume by that they mean 20,000 settlers. I'm sure they were not counting Native Americans. And the land was already being quite heavily cleared for the building of houses and barns, and also the tall pine trees, which the crown owned and went for the masts of ships. Throughout the 17th and for most of the 18th century, almost all the yarn that was made at home. And it was coarse, and it was not wonderful to wear, I'm sure. The first settlers came out here to the Boston Township number 2 in 1738. And if they were families coming, and I'm assuming that at least some of them were, they would certainly have brought their sheep with them. There's very little that I could find specifically on Coleraine, very little. In fact, probably everybody here knows more about the sheep in Coleraine than I was able to find. But sheep were very valuable because they provided milk, meat, and fiber. So they were a good animal. They were fairly easy. These were hardy, not native, but they had come from England where there were fairly hard winters and moist conditions, so they were suited for it. The Industrial Revolution in Britain is usually considered to have started about 1760. It took about 30 more years before it really got going here in the US, and that is because England very carefully guarded their wool, their processing of wool, and their product, because they wanted to be able to sell finished product in the colonies. So they did everything they could to keep out any of the machinery, but of course there were people who immigrated and knew what they were doing and were able to reproduce some of these machines. And there were plenty of people who would also smuggle in machinery. And Massachusetts was especially good for the mills because of all the rivers and streams here. The first woolen mill in Massachusetts was in Byfield, which is, I assume it's pronounced Byfield. I had never heard of it. It's about 30 miles north of Boston. And that mill was established in 1793. And at the same time, there were also mills in Watertown, which is near Boston, and in Stockbridge. Early on, wool processing was not done just in one mill. It was not a each mill did some portion of the processing. For example, in Charlemont, an Aaron Rice had a carding mill on the Wilder Brook, and there it is. That's not his, but that's a 19th century carding mill, one of the few remaining, and it's at Sturbridge, and you can see the drums with the spikes, we'll call them spikes, through which the wool was pulled to straighten it out and make it ready for spinning. But early on, they didn't yet have mills for the actual spinning of yarn. That took a few more years. A count of mills in 1810, and that was 1 year before Franklin County became Franklin County. So I'm assuming this number would include Franklin County. There were 57 carding machines and 67 fulling mills in Hampshire County. So, and fulling is when you have usually your finished product, and you put it in water so that the fibers start to mesh together, and you get a stronger, warmer, heavier fabric. So this kind of the mill that was there before, the mill that was there, the carding mill, would have produced roll eggs or rolls from which hand spinners could then spin. It's much easier to spin from a roll of already carded fleece than it is to just take a clump of wool and then try to spin it. So they could work about twice as fast and produce twice as much. The first spinning mill was established in 1813, that's in Massachusetts, by Francis Cabot Lowell. So here we get two of our Boston Brahmin names, which we will come back to, Cabot and Lowell. And that was called the Boston Manufacturing Company, but that was a cotton mill. The first woolen spinning mill was the Slater Mill in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and that was in 1794. So that was just about 30 years after that same sort of thing had been happening in Britain. And there were mill towns throughout the early 19th century in a lot of the western Mass towns: Adams, North Adams, Greenfield, Holyoke, Orange, Pittsfield. Factory Hollow, which is just north of Turner's Falls on or beside Route 2, was an industrial area of Greenfield, and that was a site of mills from 1784 on. There was a 4-story granite building there that was built in 1830 that processed wool that was actually used for the Union Army in the Civil War. And that was in operation until 1872, and the building burned in 1933. And it would be quite likely that Coleraine fleeces might have been shipped there for processing. So now we come down to what the wool was like. So the early animals, the wool was coarse, itchy. A lot of it would have been short staple, meaning a short fiber, which makes it even itchier. But at the very end of the 1700s, Spain began to let go of some of their breed of sheep, for which they were particularly noted, and that was the merino. The merino was probably a North African sheep that had been bred then with the Spanish churro. And it had been around as a breed for about 300 years, I believe, 300 or 400 years. And it's of the raising of the sheep, the control of who got the wool, who got the sheep was done by the crown. It was not something that your subsistence farmer would have had. And at the end of the 18th century, they began, mostly because of wars and, let me think how I'm going to say this, embargoes and tariffs and trying to cut people off from being able to get things and needing to have money. The Spanish aristocracy began to sell off some of the herds of merinos. And somewhere before this, I thought, was a picture.
Yeah,
Nope, it's after that. So we can come back to Jarvis. So not, well, I'm supposed to have 2 images of merinos. There they are.
Oh.
Wow.
So this is what this is, I mean, these are I was going to say bucks, but they're not called bucks, rams. This is what the rams look like when they are, I mean, these are prize-winning animals. They are fairly large. They have wrinkly skin, and they carry huge fleeces. And their fleece is incredibly soft. I don't know so much about the rams, but certainly the young animals would have had very soft. If you've ever had a merino sweater, you know how soft it is. It's it has a fairly tight kink, and as you can see, they would shear, I don't know, I would think 50 pounds off an animal like that, which is a lot. So some of these sheep were sent off and to France, where they became the Rambouillet. Some were sold in 1765 to Germany, and those are the Saxony sheep, which later also got brought to the U.S. And there was even one from the heel of Italy called the Gentili di Puglia, and there was a picture of them if you go through. So let's have a couple of. Okay, these are, oh God, the ewes. What were they? I think those are merinos. Go on. And here we have some New England superfine merinos in the snow. And you can see how tightly packed in the fleece is. Go on. Again, this I'm pretty sure is also merinos. Nope, these are Saxony. So these are the German merinos. And they're pretty similar looking. And there are two pictures of them, I think. I believe that is too. And then we should have a Rambouillet, which I think might be, that might be sex. I should have somehow, on my files it says what they are, but of course it's hard to tell. And go one more. And that's the Gentili di Puglia. So you can say they all pretty much have the same conformation. They have pretty good coverage even on the legs and the very thick, dense fleece. And the next picture should be, yes. So this is a human hair, and that's a merino sheep fiber. And I tried really hard to find the comparison with this to cashmere and to kid mohair, and I somehow just never could find one, but I know they're all about the same micron size, which is like 15 microns or so, which is very, very tiny. Okay, so, oops, there goes my, a superior ram back then, and I do not believe that this has been adjusted, could fetch at this early stage, could fetch $1,500, which would be a tremendous amount. And I mean, only the wealthy obviously could possibly afford them. So now we come to our friend William Jarvis, and that's the picture that I had before all the merinos. He was one of the Boston Brahmins. He had spent about a decade at the beginning of the 19th century in Europe, very, very successful entrepreneur. And he had also been named by his friend, President Jefferson, to be a consul to Portugal. And while he was there, this is where it gets complicated because you have to say two things at once. There was an Embargo Act of 1807, and that put a stop to any kind of importation of wool from England or France. And it had to do really with the fact that those two countries were starting to ramp up to get ready to go to war in 1812. Because they were stopping ships and ransacking them. So that's why the Embargo Act was meant to be a neutral move to prevent the seizure of American boats, ships. So no wool could be imported into this country. And that's why Mr. Jarvis said, but I know of these wonderful merino sheep. And he brought in 4,000 merino sheep. At that point, the merino fleece was selling for about $2 a pound, and other wool, like the wool that everybody had on their sheep out here, was getting 27 cents to a pound. So it was clear that this was going to be a big, big business, and that farmers who got in on it early enough were going to be able to live off the sale of not only the animals but also the fleeces. He eventually ended up with 16,000 merinos, and at that point he moved to Wethersfield, Vermont, and set up business. But he didn't stop just with raising merinos, because he realized that there was a lot more money to be made, and so he invested very heavily in New England textile mills. So he basically owned the whole process. He had brought in 4,000 merinos, and by 1824 he had 475,000. And then and I don't think this is just him, I think this is maybe in Vermont. By 1840 there were 1.7 million merinos. And I think that was just all of Vermont, but he was clearly head guy. So, rearrange my notes here. So, what actually? There we go. Sheep fever. This is AI created. I wanted to. That was great fun. I had fun. It's a little bit creepy. Especially that poor thing. So it was this perfect confluence of events which created all the conditions for the merino wool market to just explode throughout New England. It was the escalating tensions between England and France, which ended up as being the War of 1812, although there was more, obviously, Russia, everybody was involved in that, which disrupted the supply of wool. There was embargoes on French and English goods, which further restricted the availability of wool, which drove up the demand and therefore the price that you could command. Also the invention of the power loom and the setting up of the first power looms in Massachusetts and New England in general in 1814. That's that. Now, let me find my, no, thought this would work better. It does. So anyway, everybody got into the thing, and they began. Also, the Merinos didn't do all that well in New England. They had been a breed that had been on hotter, drier land, and now they were on rocky, wet, and often cold land. So farmers began quite early on to breed their Merinos with other sheep, just to get them to be a sturdier animal. And by 1840, virtually all, there were very few of the purebred, and almost all the animals had some Merino in them at that point. So they continued to increase their flocks, and that is the period of the sheep fever, which was from about 1810 to 1845. And the numbers increased tremendously, the number of people who kept sheep. And of course, sooner or later, it had to burst, the bubble had to burst. The price of wool went down because it was just glutted, the market was glutted. Also, fewer people actually wanted to be raising sheep for their fleeces because, in part, at least out here, there really weren't any mills. So they would have to get their fleeces to a mill somewhere. And again, this is not something I was able to really pin down where they sent these fleeces. And then what began to happen was that the land became really overgrazed. In 1800, the lower slopes, the slopes throughout this whole area that were below 2,000 feet were just cut down to make sheep pasture. And the land, as you know, is not great in New England. It has thin topsoil and it has rocks. And now they had really cut down so much of their woodland that they couldn't make the wooden fences. At the beginning, they had liked to make the zigzag rail fences, but now they had a whole lot less wood to work with, and they had a whole lot of stone. So that's when the stone walls began to be created. It was really, as this whole thing was getting bigger and bigger, as there were more and more sheep, that's when they were built. And Tom Wessels, who wrote the book, Reading the Forested Landscape, estimated that there are something like 125,000 miles of stone fencing throughout New England, which would take you halfway to the moon if you stretched it out. And to keep sheep in, it had to be 4.5 feet high. So that's a sizable wall you had to build. Sheep numbers in Franklin County, and this, okay, so by 1845, there was definitely starting to be a real dwindling in the number of sheep. In Franklin County in 1837, there had been 55,400. 8 years later, in 1845, it had dropped to 52,240. And 10 years later, it had dropped to 18,412. So from 55 down to 18, pretty quickly. And what they began to do was to shift to meat animals. So you would have mutton as you were raising your sheep, and wool became less important. So that is part of what happened. Between 1845 and 55, the number of sheep went down by 66%. In Coleraine, in 1845, there were somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000. Coleraine seemed to have held on to them more, because in 1855, 10 years later, there might have been, it says 2003, but of course it could have been that there were 2045 and 2001 and 55, so it may not have been a big change. You can tell this was a real, sort of like a jigsaw puzzle. Did that. One of the other real problems was dog predation, and that became a big issue in Franklin County. And Nina Reyes provided me with copies of a lot of different articles from the Courier and Gazette and from the Recorder about the dog predation and the problems that they were causing. And it wasn't just that it killed the sheep, but it would scare them, it would stress them, they would scatter, they would be wounded, and so it was more than just killing them. The licensing of dogs was begun then, with the cost of getting your dog license was put into a fund to pay farmers for their killed sheep. But of course it wasn't enough, as the farmers complained in a lot of these articles. In 1867, it was estimated there were about 113,000 sheep. Obviously this is more than just Franklin County. Maybe this is statewide. 113,000 and 112,000 dogs. And 13 years later, the number of sheep had dropped to 58,000, but there were probably more dogs, so that it would have been like 2 dogs per sheep. So that became a real problem, and it was one of the reasons why a lot of farmers got out of sheep and went to cattle, particularly more in the valley. But
who owned all the dogs? Or were they wild?
They were farm dogs. They were just, I mean, I don't think they were not coyotes, and I think they were just farm dogs. I know that when we had Angora goats, and we had sold some to Bob Armakovich, who lives down 112, he had maybe 6 of them, and 2 neighborhood dogs got in and killed at least 3 of them, and maimed 2 more, one of which had to be put down. So 2 dogs is a pack of dogs. So as far as I can tell, they were just local dogs, but they weren't feral. There was one farmer in Ashfield, his name was Zenith's Field, and he lost 12 sheep and was very upset by it, understandably.
Did he have leash laws? When did leash laws?
I have no idea, but I mean, as I say, you know, in a town like this, yeah, these 2 dogs from down near the covered bridge area went to Bob Abramovich's place and killed almost all of his Angora goats. So that's like 20 years ago.
I just thought you seem to relate on everything. It's like, oh, that's when this started, and that's when that started. And you think leash laws probably came about because of the sheep people.
I don't know. I feel that leash laws would be much more of a village, town, or city thing. But I mean, I think people on farms kind of think you can have what you want. Yeah. One of the reasons why the fields were so depleted is that sheep, of course, are grazers, and they eat right down to the root. So that's why you had a really terrible problem with erosion and flooding. Let's see. Oh, okay, so this is a field, a pasture in Coleraine. And you can see it's pretty hard scramble looking. And there was a second one that was either just before or after this. Nope, before it, I guess. Yeah, they're really, I mean, that to me shows how very thin the soil is. You've got these big rocks coming up, and they look like good, healthy meat animals. Not wool, but definitely good, healthy meat animals.
That's just not Coleraine, all of New England.
All of New England.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. No, and almost all of my information from the books and what have you, and websites and what have you that I looked at were, all of Massachusetts or Western maybe, but yeah.
That previous photo though, that is Coleraine. I'm familiar with that.
Yeah.
That image.
Yeah, and that one actually, and this says Coleraine right on it. So.
Do you know where that is exactly?
No, I don't. I use that in my talk about a murder, but
Up on Catamount?
Yes, but I couldn't verify that it was Catamount. But it is Coleraine.
It's from the picturesque Franklin book from 1890, if you ever saw that.
Yep, and that's where I took the picture from.
I have a question about dogs. So, I don't know much about dogs, but I know there are sheepdogs. Did farmers have sheepdogs? And do sheepdogs protect sheep from other dogs?
Yes.
Yes, and there are lots of guard guard dogs. I mean, there are many breeds that are guard animals. I can only assume that the farmers here just did not have them. I don't know, I get the feeling that the breeding of dogs in general is a later thing, that it was not. I mean, I just get the feeling these were mutts that, people would have as companions.
There are certain breeds that are trained to be guard dogs.
Right.
They're shepherds.
Right.
We have them that come to Gore Place every year. We do a sheep shearing festival. Yep. And they're amazing creatures.
Oh, they are.
And they're very protective.
Very.
When they're trained
to be.
It's like in Europe they had like old systems, the dogs and the sheep
right.
and the landscape.
Well, they do here too.
But I mean, it was more embedded there than here. I went to Hampshire and the farm there,
right.
He was all about that, the dogs that protected the sheep and all that. Raymond Coppinger.
Right.
He was my professor.
Yeah. And the guard dogs are actually put with the sheep as puppies, and not ever treated as a house dog or a pet. I mean, they are put with the animal when they're very small, and they just become very, very protective. But obviously, I mean, if you ever saw the film, they did a film of one of Thomas Hardy's books, and the opening scene of it shows these two dogs that or maybe just one, that just suddenly goes berserk and drives a whole flock of sheep off the cliffs. Do you remember which one that is?
I can't remember the movie, but I remember the scene.
Yeah. Oh dear, I really love Thomas Hardy. I think I could put my finger on the name of it, but I can't. But that's a powerful scene in the movie, and that's exactly what they would do. That's what dogs will do that aren't trained. So the barber, yes, what happened to our barber film? Our barber. The barber etching from 1839. That one. This shows how the slopes were denuded, right here. So higher up, they had the trees, but
that's Coleraine Center.
This is the lower slopes, and all of his work, all of the towns, the hill towns, show this same pattern of the very bare pastures on the lower slopes.
What they did with all the trees, they sell the wood.
Well, they would have burned it for one thing.
And made fences.
A lot of
They
wood.
made fences
And the
when they
big,
had
the
enough
big
wood.
trees they used for ship masts, they shot
Yeah,
them.
ship masts.
Where does this thing feel in the potash, like when they took all the trees?
That's in, yeah, to make charcoal and all that.
That was like a big period
Yeah.
here.
They harvested trees for sure, I mean, there's
Yeah, I
no
know,
doubt about it.
many times.
But the clear cut slopes were almost exclusively done for sheep grazing. I couldn't find, except for that picture that you had earlier, or before, this. You thought that this was somebody who was actually moving sheep from one pasture to another?
Well, I did hear Belden's relative used to move sheep from Hatley,
From Hatfield to
Hatfield to
Coleraine,
Coleraine.
on foot.
yeah, for the summer.
And I tried so hard to find some kind of, more about that, cause that's very European. I mean, they move sheep all the time. It's got a great word for it, oh my God, what is it? Something, I don't think I wrote it down. It's a good word. But it's a pattern which, farmers would follow. You would have your sheep, up higher in the summer where the grass was green and it was cooler, and then bring them down where it was warmer later in the year. So we get to the let's see. So we switch to meat animals, and we switch to cattle, and we switch to, here it is, transhumance, Humance, transhumance. That's taking the flock from one pasture to another. And then I have several pictures following, just that were nice pictures of Coleraine, probably at the very beginning of the 20th century, very late 19th. I really love that picture. I think it's probably a postcard. And then there's one of the Lionsville trolley. Or the trolley in Lionsville, I think we would say. In the 20th century, oh my God, which is somewhere here. Now they're really mixed up. Who knows? This is too small a table. There was a picture of a mill. So one of the questions was, did they raise other animals besides sheep for their fleece? And the answer is yes. This company was down in Holyoke. It had been a Canadian company. It's called the Far Alpaca Company. And it, at the time, was the largest in the world processing alpaca and mohair. They did both. And that lasted up until the very end of the 1930s, when it became defunct. But, so there were, but I don't know if there were alpacas. I could not find any reference to alpacas. Angora goats were brought into this country in the mid-19th century, similarly to the merinos, but they came from Turkey. And Turkey had been very, very close with keeping all of their flocks of Angora goats. And it became a big fleece producer, but again, not around here, not until we came along. So we raised, I'll just finish with what we did. We raised Angora goats for about 25, 30 years. And at one point we had upwards of 90 goats, but we generally carried 40 to 60. The Angora goat, which produces mohair, has a quite different structure. Its fiber is quite different. It does not have those little scales that you saw back on that picture of the size of each fiber. And as a result, it's a slipperier fiber, very, very durable, fire resistant, moth resistant. And if it's the kid mohair, which is the really fine, it's as fine almost as cashmere and as fine as merino. And I have several pictures. And we, at some point, when we didn't have much farming left in us, we switched to doing colored goats. This one's also a colored goat, although you wouldn't know it, but she does carry the colored gene.
The what gene?
The colored gene.
Color?
Color. See, these have, you can see that that's got dark in it. There are two colors of mohair. There's the red and there's the blue. And they start out quite dark and are really beautiful, and the mohair associations have been trying for years and years and years to bring the softness of the white Angora goat into the colored goat. And they've succeeded. They're beautiful ones. This guy had beautiful fleece, just beautiful. They were all wethers. And so since they weren't breeding animals, they kept their softness for 5-6 years. They were gorgeous. There's one up close. Very, very, very silky, long locks. Their fleece grows about 1 inch a month. So, and they're shorn twice a year. So you get a nice long fleece. And that would appear to be it. I wonder if I've left anything really important out. I did write down the references that I found particularly interesting, and I was going to do a slide, but I didn't, because Debbie had already kind of put it all together. But one of the books that was really useful is The Commonwealth History of Massachusetts, which was edited by an Albert Hart back in 1930. It's a multi-volume series, and it's just full of interesting facts. There's a website called umass.org, but the U is EWE. And that had a lot of good information, although a lot of it is also in this book, which is quite useful, but didn't have
So what's the
much
title of that book?
Landscape and Material Life in Franklin County, Massachusetts, 1770 to 1860.
Do you know how many farms there were around here? Like, I've heard that my house was a sheep farm, but who knows?
Yeah, who knows? I did not, I think it might be in this book. I would have to really look for it. But I mean, most people had some kind of farm, even if it was, a couple of apple trees and a small enclosure for a cow.
I heard it was sheep because the hill behind it,
Right, could be.
And there is a big wall up behind there, but it's not 4.5 feet. It's more like 3.
Well, of course,
So,
they do fall down too,
Yeah.
unless you can see that it's been
There
calved.
wasn't a lot of rock
Yeah.
debris. Maybe they were just cheating.
Could be. Then there's a thing called Poor Proles, Prole, like proletarian, Poor Proles Almanac, which is a podcast, and that was quite interesting. And I listened to a couple of those, and he talked about there were 3 of them, and they kid around a lot, but they talked about the sheep fever and the merinos and the Boston Brahmins. And then reading The Forested Landscape by Tom Wessels, that's a great book. So those were the books that I primarily used. I did use the history of Coleraine a bit, but not too much. So I think that's it.
I have one more question. I thought merino wool was really warm, so I don't understand why the merino sheep couldn't take the cold.
Well, for one thing, they were more susceptible to various diseases here that they, again, hadn't been bred for that kind of climate. It isn't so much the cold, probably it's more the damp and wind, because Spain is so much, at least southern Spain is so much drier and hotter. Their fleeces probably protected them from the heat. I know we had a dog that had a very heavy coat, and we sheared him one year thinking we were doing him solid, and he hated it. And in fact, his coat had kept him cooler.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of it. So they were susceptible to disease. They were, being a purebred animal, purebred animals, you know, tend always to be a little bit more difficult to raise. They just don't have necessarily the strength of hybrids.
So you don't know if there were alpaca farms around here?
I couldn't find anything about it.
I've looked
I
once
mean-
before and I never found anything.
Yeah.
Are alpaca okay with hills and rocks and?
I just don't think we were dealing with South America particularly. Now, why there
But
was
how did they
this,
get all the alpaca wool to Holyoke?
well, that's a good question, and again, I couldn't find an answer. That was one of my questions, is, so was somebody raising alpacas in this country, or were they
Yeah.
actually importing?
I'm from Holyoke, and I've never heard that alpaca.
I only happened to look for it because Nina had mentioned that she had heard there was a camelid processor in Holyoke at some time.
I'll have to ask around, because I know some people.
Yeah, that would be really interesting to know.
Yeah,
I was looking for something,
Never heard
but now
of
I've forgotten what I was
alpacas.
even looking for. Oh, I know what it was. The 1993 Coleraine Business Association listed 4 farms, and that was just the 4 that had agreed to, I don't know, whatever we asked them to pay, who had sheep. Carol and Joe Smith over on Fort Lucas Road had llamas. A lot of people had some sheep. And I don't know, I read that there were something like 1,100 sheep. This is what I got from the Franklin County thing, 1,100 sheep today in Coleraine. And I certainly don't know where they are. Does anybody have any sense? I mean, I don't know
there
anybody.
are some sheep farms around now, I mean,
In
Coleraine, yeah.
Coleraine, where? What, do you know where they are?
Um,
I'm trying to think where I've even seen sheep. I mean, I know Carol Adams used to have,
Winterberries, don't they have sheep?
yes, they have a few. Yeah, you're
and
right.
There's another one near, the apple, someplace up by the apple.
Up by Pine Hill.
Yeah, somebody has sheep up, oh yeah, right to the right of that, you'll see the sheep out when you drive by. I've seen them. You know, you go past Pine Hill and they're in the next like farm right after it.
Well, where Phil used to live, is Phil here? There he is.
hiding.
He's hiding.
Yeah.
They- Yeah, they have goats there now, the people who
Yeah.
bought your house.
But the sheep aren't, there's, I've heard of others.
But I don't know, I mean, and it's weird, I don't know where this number, when I looked it up, I just don't think that we have anything like 1,100 sheep in town.
And she's raising goats for fun, they're not for, they're like all her pets.
Uh-huh.
They all have
Well, it's
names.
really, well, so did all ours. They all have names.
The Carpenter farm back in the day, didn't they raise sheep? Carpenter's farm on
Yes.
the road?
Oh, right on the corner.
Yeah,
There was
yeah, yeah, they had a lot of sheep.
They had a lot of sheep, but that was actually
That was
Shelburne.
the 70s,
Yeah,
yeah,
and the 80s.
yeah.
When did we buy? We bought in 86. I would say they had sheep on there for at least the first 8 years we lived here.
I know Winterberry, if you go there, when they're doing the shearing, people can go to watch.
Right, yeah, and I think she might still have a couple of Angora goats. And she has,
Are the is that, who's got the Angora wool
she
goats?
might have a couple. And they have, rabbits.
Oh, Angora
Angora
rabbits,
rabbits.
yeah.
The word Angora, by the way, comes from Ankara. So the Angora, presumably any animal that's called Angora is actually, has a Turkish background. Yes,
I'm just gonna share my one sheep story. Back in the mid-60s, when we walk out to the school bus on Shearer Road in East Coleraine, our neighbor, Worth Root, had sheep. And he had this one sheep, and out of there, they were probably a mix of all the ones you're talking about. But this one, George, would always butt us when we were going out there. And now, there's a guy named George living in that house at the end of Shearer Road.
uh-oh, reincarnation,
Come back. But he
reincarnation,
used to have flies, and I know he used to bring them in the house in the winter.
really?
Yeah.
Yes,
I have one thing to say. When we had sheep at our place back in the 90s, we got a lot of advice from Lonnie York, who has a lot of Chevyettes, I believe she had. And she used to refer to our house as a sheep resort.
How many did you have?
10, 12.
you had Tunis, right?
Huh?
Did you have Tunis sheep?
I don't think we had that many.
Tunis.
It might have been until the coyotes found it. Huh?
So I think that's it. I think